So the question as stated was essentially, how much should we worry about sort of secondary versus primary findings? So to give some context, for those Vioxx studies, most of the studies, at least the early studies, were actually studies of the efficacy of Vioxx. So looking at, is it the case that Vioxx improved the arthritis condition without generating gastro problems, right? So the whole reason that the COX-2 inhibitors were a big breakthrough was that they helped arthritis without screwing up your guts, right? Aspirin can screw up your guts, give you ulcers, things like that, right? And so those were the studies that Merck had done. And so their primary outcomes were, did arthritis get better and did you show GI issues? But they also collected data just to see what was going on heart attacks. It was not anything that they were planning to study, but it ended up being sort of what was used in the litigation. And so from that perspective, the heart attack findings were a secondary outcome rather than a primary focus. And so the question is, well, is that, does that make a difference, or are there reasons to be worried? There are two ways of looking at this, and they're not mutually exclusive, and we don't, unfortunately, have a mechanical answer to it. If what you're worried about is that the expert or the scientist is sort of fudging numbers, right, cheating, there are some people who say that secondary outcomes are actually more interesting, right? Because even though it doesn't sound like it, cheating is really hard. It's not impossible, people cheat all the time, but it's actually relatively hard to cheat in a way that's not obvious. And so if you're putting in all that effort to sort of cheat on your primary outcomes, the idea that you're going to put in enough effort to cheat on your primary and secondary outcomes, it seems unlikely, right? And so there are some people who say, no, actually the secondary outcomes are less sort of susceptible to cheating, and so maybe they're more reliable. So some people believe that, and there's maybe some intuition to that. There is a problem, though, and this problem is the following. We didn't talk about it. We don't do a lot of the nuts and bolts here. If you're interested in the nuts and bolts, I suggest you read the FJC's expert evidence manual, the chapters that we sort of put. But one of the things that we don't really talk about a lot, but I might as well talk about it now, is this concept of statistical significance. So what statistical significance means is we found a correlation, or we found a particular regression outcome, right? Sort of a fancy correlation. What's the likelihood that we would have found that correlation, or what's the likelihood we would have found that regression coefficient just by random chance? That is, there's all sorts of coincidental correlations out there in the world that aren't real, right? People used to talk about, if the NFC wins the Super Bowl, the stock market will go up, or some nonsense like that. If you look at enough combinations of things, you're going to find things that look like patterns even when they're not, right? That's just a natural sort of outcome. What statistical significance attempts to do is it attempts to give you some sense of how likely it would be to find this correlation or this regression coefficient just by accident, right? There's no real relationship between these two variables, but it looks like there is, right? The NFC winning the Super Bowl has no real relationship with the stock market, right? It's just a coincidental relationship. So when we talk about statistical significance, it's an attempt to sort of say, given how big this correlation is, how likely is it we would have just observed this by random chance versus it being a real relationship? And I say real doesn't necessarily mean causal, just that these things really do move together. That's all I'm saying. If something is statistically significant, what it means is the likelihood of seeing this relationship just by mere chance is lower than some probability, right? What is that probability? Well, it's a probability that's chosen by the researcher. Often it's 5% for historical reasons that actually don't make a lot of sense, but it's a convention. In the FJC manual, or actually in some Supreme Court dicta, the Castaneda case, which was a jury selection case, basically said, hey, when we're deciding statistical significance, we should pick whatever the academics use. The academics use 5%. So if we say something is statistically significant, what we're actually saying is the likelihood of observing this relationship just by mere chance, if it doesn't actually exist in the world, is less than 5%. Okay? Admittedly, 5% is almost entirely a randomly chosen or arbitrarily chosen number, but it's the conventional number that's chosen. You could ask the expert, well, would it be statistically significant at 10%? Would it be statistically significant at 1%? And the expert should be able to answer those questions. But if the expert's not giving anything else and they say it's statistically significant, what it means is the size of this correlation or the size of this regression coefficient is such that we would expect to see this by random chance less than 5% of the time. Okay, so now with that knowledge in mind, now let's think about these secondary findings and studies. So imagine that Merck, in addition to studying heart attacks and GI and arthritis outcomes, also studied, do you get a cold? Do you get diarrhea? And imagine they study 100 different things in their study. Well, if statistical significance means just by random chance, you would find this correlation 5% of the time. If we study 100 things, even if there's no relationship between the COX-2 inhibitor and any of them, just by random chance, we would expect to find 5 of them indicating a statistically significant outcome, right? Does everyone follow that logic? If statistical significance means we would find this happening just by random chance 5% of the time, if you study 100 things, even if there's no relationships between Vioxx and any of those things in reality, it's going to look like we find a statistically significant relationship with 5 of them, right? So now what do you do as a plaintiff lawyer? You scan through all of the studies, you find the 5% of things that come out as looking as like a bad outcome, even if it's not really a bad outcome, and you go sue on its basis, right? That's the problem with looking at secondary outcomes. If you look at enough stuff, you are going to find something just by random chance. And that may be worrisome. Let me give you another kind of legal example. Walmart through the years gets a lot of sex discrimination suits against it. And maybe they discriminate, maybe they don't. But assume for the moment Walmart doesn't discriminate on the basis of sex in their paying. Right? Again, I'm not making that as a factual judgment on my place. I'm just saying let's assume in arguendo. Imagine they don't discriminate at all. But Walmart has, it's been a while since I checked, but Walmart has something on the order of 3,000 stores in the country. So imagine you're a plaintiff's lawyer. You go and you get sort of wage data from each one of those stores, and you look for a statistically significant negative relationship between being a woman and your pay at Walmart. Now remember our starting assumption. Walmart's not discriminating at all. You look at 3,000 stores, how many of the stores are going to look like they're discriminating on a statistical significance basis? 150 stores. So, assuming there's no procedural limitations or things like that, if I'm a plaintiff's lawyer, I just go search all 3,000 stores, I find the 150 that are going just by random chance to be looking like they're paying women less, and I sue those 150 stores. Maybe we view that as a problem, right? That's the problem with kind of looking at lots and lots of outcomes. You're going to find some relationships just by random chance, okay? Now, as a policy matter, as a legal matter, we might say, well, if the Supreme Court tells us we take 5% as our standard for statistical significance, really the Supreme Court is telling us we're willing to live with errors in 5% of cases. And so maybe you say, well, look, this is not a problem. It's already baked in to the policy decision. Maybe so. I just say sort of keep in mind, if you look for enough stuff, even in a totally unrelated environment, you will find these sort of random or coincidental correlations. Okay? All right. So good. Let's now move on to this correlation versus causation issue, and let's go back to our experimental setup. So remember when kind of the real lab coat science guys, they want to figure out causation instead of correlation, they run the experiment. They flip the coins. Oh, somebody had a question. Somebody said, somebody yesterday told you that statistical significance is becoming disfavored as a measure of reliability. Can you speak to that? The answer is yes and no. So nothing has changed in sort of the case law that led judges to use statistical significance. It was only ever dicta to begin with. So the Castaneda case, I think, is the first case in the 70s in jury selection. It was a jury selection in Texas. But since then, things like securities fraud cases and things like that, Supreme Court has indicated, yeah, just kind of do the 5% thing for statistical significance. And the Supreme Court, if not the Supreme Court, at least a number of the circuits in the securities reg cases have basically said if you don't see a statistically significant price movement when there's a claimed fraudulent statement, then the case can't go forward. That's Basic v. Levinson and Oracle and cases like that. So none of that has changed in sort of the case law, but in terms of kind of background science and the way people sort of think about things, people have taken more seriously this idea that 5% is an entirely arbitrary choice. And so if 5% is arbitrary, then statistical significance is arbitrary in a sense. So that's sort of a concern, okay? Where did we get 5% from? Quite literally, it was Ronald Fisher in 1920, who was the best statistician in the world, basically said, I like 5%. That's where it came from. And everybody said, well, shit, that guy's real smart. Let's take what he does. And then the courts eventually pick it up in the 70s. It's nothing more than that. You could use 1%, you could use 10%. Some of the people in law who have started arguing about this say 5% is inconsistent with the way that we talk about the law. So think about a torts case, more likely than not. What's more likely than not? That's 50%, or 50% plus epsilon. That's way more than 5%, right? And so there's some people who say maybe for statistical significance, we should be willing to accept something that comes about by random chance as much as 49.9% of the time, right? So there is this background discussion going on among kind of legal scholars saying, if we want to match our evidence rules, what we say and what we do, statistical significance is not doing that. Again, it hasn't made any inroads on the case law. That said, you've got plenty of room as a trial judge in the federal system at least to say, okay, this is all arbitrary anyway, I can pick what I want. That's one concern people have. Another concern people have is statistical significance is not the same as importance, right? Is not the same as importance. It just means, would we see this correlation by random chance or not? It doesn't say anything about how important is this correlation, much less any of these kinds of questions of, does this correlation mean causation? So there's all that kind of background discussion too. So in answer to your question, in terms of the philosophers among us, I don't count myself in that camp, they've raised all these kinds of issues. But in terms of on the ground kind of usage in the law, statistical significance is still kind of the rule of thumb that people use often, okay? Like I said, in a securities fraud case, at least since the Dura case, you can't get past motion to dismiss unless you have a statistically significant price movement. Okay. Second question is, if a finding is statistically significant, does that mean it's 95% likely to be true? No. What it formally means is, what's the likelihood that you would see a relationship this size just by random chance? If the answer is You would see it less than 5% of the time, we declare it statistically significant. If you would see it more than 5% of the time, we would declare it not statistically significant. Doesn't say anything about truth. Doesn't say anything about causation. They're distinct kinds of issues. Okay? All right, so back to the lab coat guys. They run their experiment. You still, even with the lab coat guys, you worry, did they run their experiment the right way? Sample size has to be large enough. You know, lab coat guys running an experiment on 5 people. It can be the best done experiment in the world. It's still not going to be statistically valid, right? You might say, well, geez, who does that? Well, there are medical journal articles, particularly studies of like really rare illnesses among kids and things like that, where they can only literally study 3 or 4 people. And they write it up. Is that useful? Well, it's useful in the way a case study is useful, but it doesn't have any statistical validity. So you still want to worry about those sorts of things. Did they do the randomization correctly, right? Think of randomization as flipping a coin, something that's totally random. If the answer is no, they didn't do it randomly, well then that could be a concern, okay? But assuming they've done it all right, we still have the question of, can we extrapolate? Can we generalize from the well-done experiment to the case in front of us? Think of Joyner if you want to think of that. Are rats and chicks informative for people? Okay. Still have that, right? But what you don't have is a concern about causality. If we run the experiment and we have real randomization and we have large enough sample sizes, et cetera, we can be sure that, hey, you gave Vioxx to this person and their arthritis got better. Or you gave the COVID vaccine to people and in the treatment group, there were 0 cases of COVID. In the control group, the placebo group, 10% of them got COVID. That can be seen as causal if we did the randomization correctly. Why don't we do that in law and policy? Well, again, I made the joke. We're going to look at all the babies born in Florida. We're going to flip a coin. Comes up heads, they get to go to school. Comes up tails, they don't get to go to school. You all laughed. This is a well-worn joke. It always gets the laugh. Even those of you who have seen me 20 times before, you even laughed. You're nice. You sort of forget what I said before, I guess. I don't know. But we do want to stop and ask ourselves, why don't we run that experiment? If I were to go to you, somebody raise their hand and they say, it's unethical. Why is it unethical? Well, because you're keeping those kids from school. Well, that's only unethical if you are willing to assume that schooling was good, which quite frankly was the starting point for our question. I call that question begging. You call that ethical, right? Maybe it's unethical. Maybe school is terrible for people and you guys are forcing all these people to go to school. We need an experiment to figure it out. As a practical matter, though, nobody's going to let you run that experiment, or at least really run that experiment in the way that you would have to run it to learn something. There's another problem, though, with running experiments on people in that kind of setting. People don't comply to experimental protocols as well as lab rats and chicks do, right? So imagine that we tried to run that experiment. We said, well, look, we flipped the coin. Come up heads, you get to go to school. Tails, sorry, you don't. Are the parents whose kids come up with tails, are they going to shrug their shoulders and say, well, at least we'll learn something? Of course they won't, right? What will they do? They'll sue, or they'll move out of Florida, or they'll enroll their kids in private school, right? That is, they won't comply with the protocol. As soon as you don't have compliance, that screws up your randomization. If your randomization's been screwed up, you no longer have causality, right? So we can force rats and chicks to comply. We can't force people in many circumstances. Here's sort of the dirty little secret. For the experiments that Merck and those kinds of folks run on people, even in the drug case, they have compliance problems too, right? They have compliance problems too. So, you really saw this back in the early 90s in some of the AIDS drugs tests. Folks wanted to test the AIDS drugs like the early AZT and stuff like that. And what would happen is people would go into the trials. You would get what you thought was the drug, but maybe it was the placebo. You didn't sort of get better, or you felt you were getting worse, and so what did you do? You ran and you got a test, right? And you say, hey, can you tell whether I've got the AZT or not? And if it says, no, I don't have the AZT, then what do? Well, you go to Mexico and you buy the drugs there. Or you try to get enrolled in another trial, right? That is really hard to get people to comply with experimental protocols, which is necessary for us to believe the causality. Now, in many circumstances, we think or hope or assume that this problem is not so big, right? When we test the COVID vaccine, we're all kind of relying that the tests didn't have this problem in kind of massive ways. But it really is an assumption. The lab coat guys call this worry the possibility of attrition bias. They say, look, we started our protocol, the study, people were supposed to stay in for 2 years, but in the meantime, 20% of people dropped out, right? Well, if 20% of people dropped out, if they dropped out randomly, no problem. A random sample of a random sample is a random sample. If they dropped out non-randomly, uh-oh, we're in trouble, right? We're in trouble. So this attrition bias causes problems even for the lab coat guys when they're dealing with human subjects. But from a relevance standpoint, we want human subject trials, right? So, don't feel so great about the lab coat guys either. But certainly when we move into the me kinds of studies, the policy and the legal studies, we don't even have the option of trying the randomization. So what do we do? What do we do to answer the questions about policy or legal policy and things like that? Well, for large periods of time, essentially through the mid-1990s, we more or less ignored the problem. That is, we would study policies, we would just control for a bunch of stuff, and if you said, look, I controlled for 3 more things than the last study on this topic did, I win, I'm better. Well, of course that's wrong, because you still aren't sure that you controlled for everything, that you adjusted for everything. Certainly you couldn't adjust for stuff that there's no data on. So all those studies, essentially, I'm willing to declare essentially all studies done in the social sciences pre-1998 probably as shit, quite frankly. I mean, they really were problematic. And there's a reason why you sort of, you read a study and say, well, I thought somebody just proved that that was wrong and this and that, and why do things jump back and forth? This is largely the reason, right? This guy controlled for this guy didn't control for that, they get different answers, okay? What changed in sort of the mid to late 1990s? Well, there's been what in the social sciences, it started in economics, but it sort of wound its way through the rest of the social sciences. There's been what Josh Angrist at MIT calls the credibility revolution. And basically what happened in the mid-1990s is economists said, at least some of the better economists said, I just don't want to do another crappy paper. I want to can we make an improvement? And so what they did is sort of jumping on this idea of randomization or jumping on this idea of experimentation. They sort of said to themselves, is there a way to sort of exploit what we might call natural experiments? That is, there's some weird thing that happens out in the world. Nobody planned it, nobody anticipated it, but it effectively randomized people between what looks like a treatment and a control, okay? And that sounds a little bit abstract, and so the best way to teach this stuff is to give you a bunch of examples and sort of walk through it. So one of my favorite examples, and I apologize to those of you who've seen me before, but this really is sort of a killer example to get a lot of these points through, is by a guy named David Card. David, at the time, was at Princeton. He's since moved to Berkeley. He's been at Berkeley for 30 years now. But Card was super interested in the question of what is the effect of immigration on labor markets? Right? This is perennially an interesting question. Econ 101, those of you who've been through the econ school, Econ 101 is all about supply and demand. Henry will tell you Econ 201 and 301 and 401 are all about supply and demand too. But for sure, every economist agrees that Econ 101 is about supply and demand. So think about a labor market that has this infusion of immigrants. What's that mean? That means the supply for labor moves out. You get an increase in supply, what does that mean? That means wages go down or price goes down. It's literally Econ 101, right? So what is many people's kind of view of immigration? Well, if you're, if you're in the labor market that immigrants are going to compete on, your view is bad. You say, oh, this is going to drive down my wages. But there are versions of the Econ 201 story that says, well, that's not the whole story, right? There's other stuff that happens. One of the things that happens is immigrants don't only increase supply of labor, but immigrants buy stuff too, right? And what does that do? Well, that increases the demand for labor. And so if supply shifts out and demand shifts out, who knows what the net effect is, right? Supply shifting out lowers the price, demand shifting out increases the price. What do you end up with on net? That is, theory cannot solve the question of, is immigration good or bad for labor markets where the immigrants are entering? Now, pre-David Card, there were 5 million papers that tried to do some version of, let's get a bunch of data on labor markets, wages in labor markets, and immigration flows. And just let's run the correlation, let's run the relationship. These papers were all terrible, right? Why were they all terrible? Because how do you know that you've adjusted for everything that matters, right? It would be one thing if immigrants just sort of showed up randomly some places at some times and not at other places at other times, but that's not the way immigration works, right? It's not as though, I'm the immigrant, I have some random alarm clock that goes off. When it goes off, I get up, I close my eyes and I throw a dart at the map of the world and say, look, Greenland, here I come, right? That's not the way it works. I instead immigrate at a particular time to a particular place because of all sorts of reasons that are entirely invisible to the researcher. If the researcher knew all the reasons, maybe the researcher could control for it, but the researcher doesn't know all the reasons. So what does that mean? It means that your correlation that you identify may not be causation. So what Card did is he sort of said, is there something that happens out in the world that is effectively like a randomization? And what Card focused on was something called the Muriel boat lift in 1980 in South Florida, in Miami. So in 1980, you had Castro wanted to get rid of a bunch of folks, mostly rabble-rousers, but some other folks that he wasn't happy to be in Cuba. And he basically said, look, if you want to leave, show up in the Muriel Harbor on day X, and there are going to be boats. And so you had thousands of Cubans sort of show up in sort of a 2 or 3 month period, got on the boats, and where did they end up? They ended up in Miami, right? Card says, these guys didn't show up in Miami at that time, or Miami itself, because they were planning to, right? They showed up in Miami because Castro opened the gate, and geography being what it was, you end up in Miami if you leave Cuba in sort of a rickety boat. That's the way it happens. So Card says this is as good as an experiment. So what Card does is he looks at what happened before and after in the Miami labor market after you see this influx of the immigrants. Now that's not where you have to, that's not where you end. So remember, in a lab coat guy experiment, randomization's important, but another important part is having a treatment and a control group, right? That's what you use the randomization for. Some people get the treatment, some people get the sugar pill. Some people get the treatment, some people get the placebo. Why do you need a control group in an experiment? Well, because the control group is there to show you the counterfactual, right? That's what control groups are for. We would like to know what would have happened to the people we give the drug to if they hadn't gotten the drug, right? It's like tort causation. What is the but-for world? I can't observe you both getting the drug and not getting the drug, so my second best is to observe somebody who was in your same position that just by random chance didn't get the drug, right? That's why we have the control group, to show us the counterfactual world. So for Card, he can't just look at Miami before and after, because you need to have some sense of, well, what would have happened in Miami had the immigrants not shown up, had the Cubans not shown up. And so what he does is he sort of compares Miami to similar labor markets at the same time that didn't get the inflow of Cubans. So he has some argument that Houston looked a lot like Miami at the same time period, but of course the Cubans didn't show up in Houston. He also, I think, looks at Jacksonville for similar kinds of reasons. I think he looks at Tampa for similar kinds of reasons. And so Card says, there, now I've got my natural experiment. Just randomly, some people show up in Miami. I can see what happens before and after. Compare that what happens in these other cities where immigrants don't show up. And what he finds is no effect on wages. That is, any effect that he saw in Miami on wages before and after, he also saw in these other places not getting immigrants. This paper is a blockbuster. Not necessarily because we believe it, and I'll come back to that in a second, but because it gives you this idea of what do we mean by a natural experiment. It's some weird thing that happens out in the real world. Nobody plans it, nobody anticipates it, but it sort of randomizes or otherwise sort of manipulates the policy variable that we're interested in, and we use that as if we were doing a lab coat type experiment. Now, when we've got this natural experiment in front of us, teach judges, I teach students, you should follow a cookbook approach in thinking about this natural experiment. There are 3 steps in your recipe. Step 1 is, do I really believe the supposed randomization is really a randomization? Right? That is it the case that this really did kind of just show up, unanticipated, unplanned, unexpected? So if, Castro died a couple of years ago, if we publish Castro's memoirs and we go back and we look, and in 1975, Castro writes, "Dear Diary, I want to get rid of some rabble-rousers, but I'm really worried. There's sort of economic malaise in the US. I don't want to send my people off into a bad labor market, so I'm going to hold off." And then a couple of years later, he says, "Dear Diary, right? Reagan Revolution, things are looking up. Now is the time." It would be a bad experiment, right? Because it would sound as though Castro was making a choice particularly due to labor market kinds of conditions. So it'd be a bad experiment, okay? So step 1, try to think, is there a reason why this might be not really as random as I think it is? Or another way to think about it is, a randomization is something where the thing you care about changes, but you're pretty sure nothing else changes, right? So if you think, yeah, there's this labor market change because of the immigration, but I also think there's all this other stuff going on that sort of is changing the Miami labor market, it's not a good experiment, right? When the lab coat guys do an experiment, they don't manipulate 6 things at once, they manipulate 1 thing at once. Because if you manipulate 6 things and you see some change, how do I know it's because of number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6? I don't. But if I manipulate just 1 thing and I see a change in the outcome, aha, now I know why it is. So step 1 in our cookbook for natural experiments is this randomization, is it really randomization? Is it really just changing the 1 thing that I care about? Or is it changing a lot of other stuff too? That's step 1. Step 2 in our recipe is, do I have a good treatment and control comparison? Okay. If even the lab coat guys, if the lab coat guys did their experiment and they kind of made it such that all the people who got treatment were men and all the people who were placebo were women, that wouldn't be a very good comparison maybe, right? Because you might think, well, geez, health changes differently for men and women. And so the women aren't a very good counterfactual for the men, right? You feel better about the counterfactual the more similar the 2 groups are, right? The more similar the 2 groups are. Again, use your torts intuition. When we do the but-for test in torts, it's like we sort of say, hey, we would like to see the world go forward where the negligence occurs and then rewind the tape and then let it go forward where the negligence doesn't occur, and we'd like to compare those 2 things. Why do we like that? Well, because they're identical but for the negligence. Well, that's what we would like in our treatment and control for our natural experiment too. Card, if he had access to it, he would rather compare Miami to Bizarro Miami, right? It's just like Miami in every single way, but it didn't get the immigrants. Unfortunately, he doesn't have access to Bizarro Miami, so he has to use Houston, he has to use Jacksonville. The less good you feel about that comparison, the less reliable the natural experiment is, okay? Those first two issues, is there randomization and are the treatment and controls kind of comparable enough? Those are reliability issues in Daubert terms. Those are internal validity issues in science speak. The third part of your recipe is a relevance concern. No matter how good I feel about the experiment or the natural experiment from an internal validity or from a reliability standpoint, does it really extrapolate? Can I really generalize it? So with CARD, it's funny, every time there's a sort of a fight about immigration, the New York Times will run a story and about 10 paragraphs down they'll say, as David Card showed us in 1996, immigration doesn't affect labor markets. Well, even if you had no other problems with the CARD paper, you might still not be willing to make that jump, right? You would want to stop and say, well, is the Miami situation in 1980 similar enough in various ways to answer a question for Mexican immigration in California in 2000 or Syrian immigration in Cologne in 2005 or those kinds of things. Unfortunately, as I sort of hinted before, this is as much a soft qualitative inquiry as it is a hard statistical scientific inquiry, right? You would do the same kinds of things. You would sort of think about, is it close enough? Is it similar enough such that I believe this study can be extrapolated to the current question in front of me? I don't know. I'm not an expert I'm not a sociologist. I'm not an expert in immigration. So I don't know if any of these are important questions, but sort of questions you might think. Well, are labor markets in 1980 and 2020 all that comparable? Right? Maybe one difference is there's a lot more automation in 2020 than in 1980. So no matter what I believed about Miami in 1980, the relevant labor market might be very different, right? That might be a concern. Or sort of a more anthropological concern. There was already a huge Cuban population in Miami in 1980, right? Tons of people had left in the 50s when Castro first took over. Does it make a difference for an immigrant group showing up where there's a pre-existing community, right? I'm the 200,000th Cuban to show up in Miami versus I'm the first Syrian to show up in Denmark. Does that make a difference? I don't know, but these are the kinds of questions you would want to ask yourself in sort of extrapolating these issues, okay? So that's our cookbook, right? Is there randomization? Do I think the treatment and controls are comparable? And then third, do I feel good about extrapolating the results into the question in front of me? So like I said, this is a topic that is sort of better taught through examples. So I'm going to give you probably 2 or 3 more examples, and we're going to walk through these questions. We're going to apply each of these questions, sort of, apply our cookbook to each of these issues. So around the same time as CARD, there's a guy named Steve Levitt. I don't know if anybody know his name, but if you ever read the Freakonomic books, Steve Levitt is the Freakonomics guy. And Steve sort of made his whole career on these natural experiments. And Steve's sort of first blockbuster paper was on the question of, do police affect crime? Right? It's a perennially important topic, super important right now, right? One of the questions, not the only questions, but in sort of the defund the police movement, one of the questions we would want to answer is, well, how much of an effect is there of police on crime? If the effect is not much, well then, geez, maybe all these other reasons allow us to sort of say, okay, fine, cut police funding. However, if there's a big effect of police on crime, well then maybe we take more pause, okay? So answering this question is super important. Prior to Levitt in 1997, there was a literature review that looked, and there was something like 250 articles on this question in sort of economics, sociology, and criminology journals. And virtually all of the papers were just junk, right? Why were they junk? They were junk for the same reasons we've been talking about. How do you do this study? Well, I did some correlations. Places with a lot of Camden, New Jersey has a lot of police and there's a lot of crime there. Lancaster, Pennsylvania, hardly any police, almost no crime. Case solved, right? No, of course that's wrong. You can't just do the correlation, right? Well, fine, I adjusted for a bunch of stuff. Yeah, well, but did you adjust for demographic? Well, sure, you adjusted for demographic. Did you adjust for kind of underlying criminal propensity? Well, how the hell do I adjust for that? You don't, right? There's no underlying data on that. So what do? Well, what Levitt said is we need to find one of these natural experiments. So here was Levitt's natural experiment. Levitt sort of said to himself, in the US, in local elections, elections for mayor and things like that, the strongest or the most kind of credible way, the most consistent way that mayor candidates attempt to gain re-election is by saying, I'm tough on crime, right? That's the can't miss message. Levitt says, but of course there's a problem. Anybody can say they're tough on crime, but you need to sort of put your money where your mouth is. And so what Levitt sort of deduced is he sort of said, I bet you when mayors are up for re-election, they probably hire a lot of police or get a lot of police hired. Because that way, a couple of weeks or a couple of months before the election, they could have a press conference and they say, look, I'm tough on crime. I care this much about your kid's safety that I just hired all these extra cops. And so what Levitt did is he put that together with the insight that in the US, election timing is historically determined, right? What do I mean by that? Well, when Philadelphia has an election, why do they have an election? They have an election because they had an election 4 years before that, and 4 years before that, and 4 years before that. All the way back to, I think it's like 1870, the election cycle in Philadelphia kind of was set. New York City, same thing. I think with them it was 1890, right? And they've been having elections every 4 years since then. Levitt says, aha, that seems like a randomization to me. For weird historical reasons, this city is having an election in this time period. This other city is not. And for political economy reasons, in election years, mayors who are trying to win re-election hire a lot of cops. So he collected a bunch of data on election timing, collected a bunch of data on cop hiring, and he found that, in fact, it is true. In election years in the US, cities that are having elections have surges in police hiring. There's your experiment. If I'm Levitt, I'm going to look at what happens before and after we have an election in New York City as compared to what's happening before and after in the same period in Philadelphia when they're not having an election. A couple of years later, we look at Philadelphia before and after comparing to New York City and do this all across all the other cities. Levitt found that police had a huge effect on crime. Right? Somebody asked the question earlier about statistical significance versus importance. He found not only a statistically significant effect on crime, but a practically important effect on crime. He found that if you hire more police, you increase police by 10%, property crime goes down by 3%, violent crime goes down by 6%, and the big ticket violent crimes, murders and rape, go down by about by about 11%, right? These are huge effects. I don't know how many of you are interested in crime policy. Even the 3% property crime effect is huge, much less the 11% murder and rape decline, okay? So let's walk through our cookbook recipe. I already gave you the argument for why Levitt thought this was a good experiment, this is good randomization. Right? New York City has its election because 4 years before it had had elections all the way back a long time. It's like a predetermined schedule. It's unrelated to crime. Sounds pretty good. Okay? However, I don't know how many of you have ever watched The Wire. It's old now, 20 years old, but it was a pretty popular show. And The Wire was a show, it's by David Simon. It was on HBO. But David Simon was a Baltimore Sun reporter who got kind of sick of being a reporter, and so he embedded himself with the Baltimore PD. And then he did that for a year, and then a year later he embedded himself on sort of a drug corner in West Baltimore. And he used these experiences to write books and then eventually TV shows. He wrote Homicide, the TV show that was on in the 90s, and then The Wire was on HBO in sort of early 2000s. But it was based on kind of what he had observed. And in The Wire, one of his underlying kind of story arcs in the first season was when the mayor, the guy who was sort of based on Martin O'Malley, essentially, when the mayor was up for election, he went to the police chief and he said, I want crime to get better. You know, election's coming up, I want crime to get better. Now, I suppose there's one interpretation of that, which is, come on guys, let's take one for the team and do a good job. But the way it played out in The Wire is the police chief basically told all his district guys, he said, look, I don't care how you do it, but we need to see a 20% increase or decrease in crime, essentially, right? So what did the precinct captains do? They just started lying about the crime, right? This crime, you don't even report it. This crime, you downgrade from this crime to that crime, right? Baltimore, on an average year, has something like 340 murders. A lot of them are drug-related. Well, if you think the drug murders aren't really going to get lots of attention, instead of writing this down as a murder, you write it down as natural causes. You do that for just 30 murders, and all of a sudden you decreased murder rate by 10%, right? Why does that cause a problem in our cookbook? Well, again, one way to think about randomization is the thing you care about, the thing you're studying is changing, but nothing else is changing. If the David Simon story is correct, it's not just that we're getting more police in election years, but the crime coding is changing in election years too. So was Levitt discovering an actual deterrence effect of police on crime? Or was he sort of picking up this change in the crime coding? We don't know, right? So that's would be a knock against the Levitt study. Step 2 in our comparison. Are the treatment and controls good, right? Is Philadelphia a good control or a good comparison for New York? Is New York a good comparison for Baltimore, right? This is largely going to be a qualitative inquiry. Maybe you think, well, yeah, I like the northeastern cities as comparisons, but I don't like comparing the northeastern cities with the California cities. You could do that comparison. If you had some expert in front of you, if you had Levitt in front of you, you could say, hey, go back to your data and just run it on the Northeast, or just run it on the California cities. You could do that, right? If you felt better about some comparisons versus others. What Levitt did is he said, I'm going to do all the cities, all the big cities, and just use them to kind of compare for each other. But that would be a source of concern for you if you don't think that's a good comparison. Okay? And then the last one, assuming that you came up with good answers for those first two and you kind of believe the internal validity. Probably you don't. We've got a reason to believe this, and for other reasons, Levitt's paper probably was wrong. But if you didn't have those concerns, then you would go to this external validity question, or this generalizability question, right? Is it the case that what Levitt found studying crime in the 80s is relevant to crime in the 2020s? Well, if you know anything even about baseline crime levels, you might be worried, right? Crime was way higher in the 80s than it is in the 2020s. That alone might say these are apples to oranges kind of comparisons. I'm unwilling to kind of do the extrapolation, okay? Let's go on to another natural experiment, because I'm not seeing questions, so we'll do another natural experiment. On Penn's campus, where I teach, Penn is in West Philadelphia, historically relatively high crime, although as with most other cities in recent years, crime's kind of disappeared. But anyway, Penn has this interesting arrangement with the Philadelphia police force going years back, where Penn police, who are trained like regular cops, right, certified like regular cops, but they're employed by us, Penn police have arrest powers within the historical boundary of the University of Pennsylvania. Can't go past the boundary, but within the boundary they can operate just like regular police. Okay? Penn, I probably don't have to tell you, is proportionally lots richer than Philadelphia. And so we actually employ about 3 times as many cops per kind of geographic unit as the city of Philadelphia does. So essentially we've got a boundary that dates to the 40s essentially on when the campus is, where within the campus you've got a ton of cops, and right off the campus you've got proportionately less cops, fewer cops, right? Natural experiment, right? One side of the boundary, lots of cops, other side of the boundary, fewer cops, otherwise not much different as between the two. What did we find when we looked at this? Essentially using the campus boundary as the randomization, and the comparison being the blocks right on one side of the boundary versus blocks right on the other side of the boundary. What we found is cops seem to have a big effect. You step out of the campus, right? Crime goes up by about 40-50% depending on the crime category. Literally, that's the only difference, right? Walking across there. Not in every category. We didn't find any effect on murders and things like that, but we found big effects on burglaries, robberies, thefts, assaults, things like that. Okay? Let's do, even because it's mine, doesn't mean we shouldn't do our recipe, we shouldn't do our cookbook. Is this a randomization? Right? Is this boundary an arbitrary kind of shock or change in sort of the effective coverage of cops? Right? If you went on the campus today, I defy you to be able to notice the boundary. We don't have flags, we don't have anything like that. Buildings on either side look the same. I've got colleagues who have taught at Penn for 25 years. They can't tell me where the boundaries are, right? There are actually school buildings on both sides of the boundaries. There are teaching buildings on both sides of the boundaries. There are students living on both sides of the boundaries. Seems like a good break. Seems like there's only that. Police coverage is changing. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference one block to the next. Okay? Is it the case that there's some other difference going on as between the two places? Maybe, right? That's the kind of thing you would want to think about, though, in doing your step 1 and step 2 of your cookbook. Okay. We tried to do some things to kind of rule out differences. So we looked at, hey, are there more parking tickets on either side of the boundary? Cops don't do parking tickets in Philadelphia. It's the parking authority. If you think there's something about criminality or rule following that differs campus to not campus, you should maybe think that there should be a difference in parking tickets. We didn't see a difference in parking tickets. If you think it's something about kind of students are more conscientious or students are kind of more risk averse when they're on campus than when they're off campus, we looked at like traffic accidents on both sides of the boundary, didn't see a difference. So we attempted to kind of rule out these other kind of unobservable differences across. But like I said before, this is largely going to be a qualitative inquiry. Okay? It's largely going to be a qualitative inquiry. Now, the next question is, if you believe the study, remember what step 3 is, am I willing to, or can I feel that I can extrapolate, that I can generalize the results of the Penn University study to other kinds of places? Well, you might say, well, geez, I'm worried, Klick. You told me that the Penn cops are just like every other cop, but still, maybe they're different, maybe they're happier, maybe they're better paid, maybe they're, maybe it's something like that, right? If you've got that sort of worry, then maybe you say, well, I couldn't just use the Penn results to kind of prompt me to hire a lot more cops that are not university employees, right? Because I think that's a relevant difference or something along those lines. Or you might say, well, I don't know if it's a difference of the cops, but I just think it's a difference of people act differently when they're on a college campus than when they're off a college campus, right? These are the kinds of inquiries that you would want to make in sort of extrapolating things, okay? One quick follow-up, which will lead us into kind of our last part of our discussion. Particularly on that last point, maybe I think there's just something fundamentally different about college campuses than non-college campuses. We did a follow-up study. We haven't published it yet. We probably will soon. But we did a follow-up study on Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins is in Baltimore, but it's a similar kind of smart school, has a similar student profile to Penn and things like that. But Johns Hopkins is kind of interesting for the following reason. Up until last year, Baltimore, or actually the state of Maryland, had a law in the books that basically said private entities cannot have their own police forces. Okay? So what we did is we looked at the Johns Hopkins boundary just like we did at the Penn boundary. Now, Johns Hopkins has a ton of security guards. They don't carry guns, they can't arrest. You know, they're guys in the yellow vests that can yell stop, or I'll yell stop again, right, that kind of thing. If you think our Penn results were primarily driven by something different about college campuses, but not the police, what's your prediction? Your prediction is you should be able to do the same study on Hopkins and see the same thing. You walk off the boundary, the campus boundary on Johns Hopkins, and crime should jump, just like it did on the Penn boundary. When we look at Johns Hopkins, no difference. You step off the boundary in the Homewood neighborhood, there's no change in crime. This leads me into sort of my last point, which is, as you can sort of get the sense of me talking about these studies, some of them seem pretty clever, but even for the clever studies, you're saying to yourself, I'm not so sure I believe it. I've got worries. I've got worries on all three steps of the recipe. There is no perfect study. Never has been, there never will be, right? There is no study that when we go through all three of these steps in the cookbook, that we're going to say, I have no concerns at all, right? However, with the police and crime, I just use it as an illustration, there is something interesting about that literature. There are a bunch of really good studies that you go through the steps and you say, yeah, I've got some concerns, but the concerns are not huge. And they're all saying the same thing, right? Is the punchline that we've gotten from that literature. So I've got a number of contributions to that literature, but it's not just me. The punchline that we get from that literature is that police in general seem to generate a lot of deterrence. Not in every crime category. Most of the literature says there's not really much of an effect on murders. Most of the literature says there's not much of an effect on rapes. But burglaries, assaults, thefts, stolen automobiles, things like that, the literature is at a pretty solid answer that you add police, you get a lot less crime. Not just statistically a lot less crime, but in an important sense, right? Add 10% police, property crimes come down by about 3%. Assaults come down by about 4 or 5%, right? If you go and you cost out how much it hire a cop, how much it costs to hire a cop versus the value of those crimes, it passes the cost-benefit test by and large, right? Here's the thing, none of those papers is perfect. We could go through all of them, none of them is perfect. You'd have problems at a number of the different steps of the cookbook. But here's the important point. The problems across each of those papers are different problems. Right? I might have a step 1 problem with Klick's results. I might have a step 2 problem with Levitt's results. I might have a step 3 problem with somebody else's results. But they're all different problems, and yet the literature has converged on basically the same answer across all these different papers. This is when we start, in a meta sense, to feel that there is reliability in a literature. It's not because there's a perfect paper. Spoiler alert, there's never a perfect paper, right? It's because you've got a bunch of pretty good imperfect papers that sort of fit together in complementary ways. That's when we start to know something in sort of a social science setting, okay? So that's what you're going to be looking for if you wanted to kind of analyze a literature like this. Are you getting convergence in the results? Are each of the papers good but not perfect? And are the imperfections kind of not duplicating across the papers? Because imagine, we could have 1,000 papers all say the same thing, but if they all have the same flaw, that's not so surprising. What we're looking at is sort of a bunch of papers that have different flaws and yet still are saying the same thing. That's about the closest that we can get. Okay? That's about the closest we can get. So there is a bit, though, of a disconnect on the way that sort of we should think about literatures from this scientific perspective and the way that sort of the law is set up for you guys to think about papers and experts, right? If you take, since I've already talked about the Garza case, right? If you take the Texas expert evidence rule in epidemiology cases, right? The rule basically says, you need 2 independent articles. Well, that's a good starting point. Independence is good. That's sort of like, I want 2 articles that are not necessarily the same, right? What if I have 2 articles, but they're using the same sample? In the Garza case, that came up, right? They had one original study and then another study that was sort of a meta-analysis that had included that first study. And so one of the things that the appellate court blew up is they said, look, you don't meet the 2 independent studies argument. That's a good inclination. But is 2 enough? Well, from a social science standpoint, I would say no, right? 2 is better than 1, but it's not as good as 5, right? Is there anything we could do on this disconnect, right? Well, in a state like Texas, it's not as though as a trial judge you could start requiring, no, I don't like this Havner rule. I'm going to move for you have to show me 5 studies, right? In the US federal system, you might be able to do something like that. Say, look, I don't feel good until you've shown me kind of a number of these studies that are independent and sort of are not perfect, but are complementary in this particular way. The other thing that we sort of worry about in this disconnect between what we think of scientifically and the way things work in the courts, there is sort of this sense that often in Daubert hearings, if I see a particular flaw in one study, I just kick it out, or I maybe even kick out the whole expert, right? And maybe there are reasons for that. But again, I want to sort of hammer home this idea, there is no perfect study. And if you start sort of requiring perfect studies, it's necessarily going to cause problems, I think. And so to the extent that you sort of reorient yourself on, I'm not going to do the sort of the gotcha law school thing where you say, oh, look, I found one flaw, so now it's out. Try to think of it more holistically probably makes more sense, right? That's probably the case, okay? Still not seeing any kind of questions, so let's go on in the last couple of minutes. Relatedly, on this independent studies issue, one thing that we see in social science is you probably prefer seeing studies that are by different folks, right? So you get this funny aspect in social science. To some extent, you get it in hard science too. But in social science, for sure, somebody becomes an expert in a topic, and they write 15 papers in that topic. Now, you can sort of see why that kind of makes sense. You might say, oh, geez, he's an expert. We ought to exploit and leverage that expertise. And that's fine. But I want to sort of warn you about a downside that comes with it, right? If I'm the same person doing sort of the studies across, a topic, and I've got blind spots, I've got biases, I've got sort of issues, that might show up in each of those papers, right? And my blind spots and my biases and my issues might not be clear to you, but it may well be sort of making a difference in each of these papers. In each of these papers that I'm talking about, there are 50,000 decisions that I as a researcher make that actually I don't ever even talk about in the paper. So you might sometimes dupe yourself into thinking, well, I'll just read the paper and I'll be able to suss out his biases. Nope, sorry. There are a million choices that I make in any research project that never get documented. It's just as a practical matter, it just doesn't happen. I use this data set versus that data set. I use this test versus that test. I'm not going to explain that usually in a study. Maybe on cross-examination, you push me and I come up with an argument, right? But as a practical matter, decisions I make in one paper are probably going to replicate themselves in other papers and so on and so forth. So if the paper is flawed because of this decision, maybe the 10 papers I write on the topic are going to be flawed. That's one concern. So all other things equal, you might feel better if you say, okay, you're this expert, you're showing me a literature, this literature has 20 different people writing the 20 different papers. I feel better about that than this guy who's showing me a literature that has 10 papers written by one person, right? That's one thing. Another thing that we've seen kind of in our experience in social science is, to the extent that you have somebody that builds his or her expertise in a particular area, it's just human nature that you become more defensive, right? So what do I mean by this? Well, I'm sort of the flip side of this. If you look at my CV, I've written a ton of papers, and very rarely do I ever write in the same area twice, right? So if you want to take a dump on me, call me a dilettante, right? That's what the other side say, oh, Klick's a dilettante, right? There is a benefit to this, though. You prove any one of my papers is wrong, yeah, it's smart, so I don't want to feel that. I'd rather not make mistakes. But it's one paper of 50, right? If instead I've built my entire career on sort of one result or one area, you prove the one wrong, that's going to be a domino effect. Guess what? Which of the two of us are going to be more likely to say, oh yeah, you're right, that's a great point? The guy who's written 20 papers on the topic is going to defend it like crazy, perhaps even to the extent of being dishonest, right? So there's this sort of indirect, sort of soft metric that really does suggest a benefit to people sort of not being the same person working in the same area over and over and over again. And we've seen this, right? That you may have read in the newspaper about this so-called replicability crisis in the social sciences. It's mostly about psychology, but you could tell a similar story about economics. You could tell a similar story about political science. That is, when independent people often come into a literature and they try to duplicate results that had been kind of well-known, everybody agreed, oh yes, so-and-so proved this a long time ago. When independent people come into a literature and they try to duplicate, more often than not, the results don't replicate, right? In most of the most egregious of these situations, it's been situations where it's literally one guy who's written 50 papers. I feel a little bit bad about it, but I have a chair at Erasmus in the Netherlands. The most terrible of the replication situations was some psychology guy there at Erasmus who had been sort of a field leader for 30 years on some experimental psychology results. When somebody came in and said, well, geez, I can't duplicate your results. And then another person came and said, I can't duplicate your results. Eventually he said, yeah, that's because I've just been making them up for 30 years, right? Now, in some sense, the Dutch guy is to be credited, right? He basically said, you got me, the jig is up, right? That's not always what happens, right? Sometimes these guys will start fighting and it becomes really ugly and you don't know who to believe. But as a general rule of thumb, all things equal, you'd rather see a diversity of people or even kinds of people. So there was a big literature on the death penalty, effect of the death penalty. And there, you sort of had two camps. Every time the economists had written about it, they basically said, look, there's this deterrence effect. Every time you saw the sociologists wrote about it, they said there wasn't a deterrence effect, right? So there too, you had sort of the biases showing up, right? Sociologists are super liberal, economists are, at least relative to the academy, more right, and you were finding sort of, hey, the one group is finding sort of the result you expect they would find, the other group's finding the result you expect they would find, right? It'd be better if you had somebody else coming into this and sort of saying, well, look, I'm not particularly ideological, or I don't have sort of this vested interest in this sort of thing. It's, I'd say this as a side note, it's probably not surprising that most of the Economist's articles were published in the Journal of Political Economy, which is the house journal at the University of Chicago, right? University of Chicago, a particular believer in deterrence, a particular believer in the rational actor model, and so it was predisposed probably to believe results suggesting that the death penalty had deterrence effects. Okay, we've got 1 minute left, and so the way we want to wrap it up is, if you take anything away from this, what you want to take away from it is there are no perfect papers. Even the papers that look great probably have problems. So you should never believe a paper. You should maybe believe a literature if that literature has a bunch of well done, though not perfect, papers in it, where the imperfections are complementary, are different, rather than just duplicated. And all things equal, you'd rather see a literature written by a diversity of folks. Those are probably your best rules of thumb in this kind of literature. All right, that's it. Thanks.